Much has been written about the Druids, the enigmatic and mysterious priesthood of the Celtic world. Majorly in Roman accounts, they are seen to play the roles of judge, jury, and philosopher-priest, all the while acting as law-keepers for the sacred tradition. Despite their infamy in literature, we have almost no definitive archaeological evidence that can be linked to them outside of circumstantial or votive deposits, bog bodies, hoards, or early possible religious sanctuaries. For all we know of them, very little is known of their actual belief system with any real certainty. From the echoes of the 7th century Collecteana in the Book of Armagh, however, a treatise that chronicles St. Patrick's conversion of Ireland, a single word has persisted and caused controversy among scholars of Celtic religion. A single word that may very well be a linguistic fossilised survival of Druidic eschatological doctrine. This relic of pre-Christian religious thought could be a window into understanding the Druids' view on apocalypticism. Before we travel to Ireland, it's worth rooting ourselves in a general background of who and what the Druids were and what their institution represented. Pliny compiled his monumental Naturalia Historia in the 1st century AD, collecting information from the furthest reaches of the known world at the time, mining the writings of hundreds of previous authors, philosophers and teachers. While some of his writings are factually accurate, he has a tendency to lean into the overactive imagination and propaganda of the Greeks. Look no further than Book 3, for instance, to hear of the glory of Rome in, quote, destroying those horrible activities in which human sacrifice was thought to please the gods, and eating the victim was thought to be good for one's health. Pliny's characterization of the Druids is by no means in isolation among ancient polemics. This picture of the Celtic priests, or even really outsider groups at large, as wild, uncivilized and savage, is commonplace among Greco-Roman authors. While Pliny's charge of cannibalism may seem extreme, it's worth noting that even early Christian groups were accused of such in the context of the Eucharist by pagan contemporaries. But if we were to strip away the propaganda, what kind of picture would emerge of the Druids? If we were to believe the testimonies of Roman authors, they were a hugely dominant force and institution within Britain and Gaul, although notably according to Caesar never in Germania, before and during the process of Roman occupation. The Druids represented a highly organised and well-educated religious opposition to the imposition of Roman rule, one that was capable of causing huge problems, not only for the armies and religious officials, but also to the new forms of government and administration. Their area was largely Iron Age Britain and Gaul, particularly during the 1st centuries BC and AD. However, we have literary testimony for their presence in Gaul up to the 4th century. Around 60 BC, the Gallic druid Diviciacus visited Rome in order to petition the Senate for military aid in the repulsion of a rival Germanic tribal leader, and was hosted by Cicero. To his surprise, Cicero accounts Diviciacus' legendary skill in divination in a letter to his brother Quintus. Quote, "The system of divination is not even neglected among the barbaric peoples, since in fact there are druids in Gaul. I myself have known one of them, Diviciacus of the Aedarthe, your guest and eulogist, who declared that he was acquainted with the system of nature which the Greeks called natural philosophy, and which he used to predict the future by both augury and inference." During Caesar's conquests in Gaul, he wrote extensively about the Druids in his Bello Gallico, describing their far-reaching influence in the fields of religion, politics, teaching, and judicial matters. Caesar and Diviciacus were even friends, and the Druid frequently supplied Caesar's legions with grain from Gaul. As centuries passed, however, the unerring respect that these early Roman authors held for the figures gradually waned until Pliny specifically records the desire to eradicate them by the Roman emperors. His tirade against them appears to be reflective of his view of the provenance of Britannia more generally. To the Romans of his time, it was a place that was, quote, a void beyond our world, spellbound by magic, performing its rites with so much ritual that it might almost seem to be the source of Persian ritual. Such a sentiment is echoed by Lycan and Tacitus, who fall to similar prejudices, as often dwelling on dark and barbarous rites of a wicked religion. Enigmatically, however, for such a prominent and terror-inducing group to the Romans, and a seeming core of Celtic society accustomed to the highest honour, we might rightly have expected the Druids to have left tangible evidence and traces of their ritual activity in the archaeological record, or Iron Age material culture. even if they were, for all intents and purposes, emasculated by imperial expansion. But the reality is that despite the wealth of archaeological material, there is virtually nothing that can be linked directly to Druids. We do have mountains of circumstantial evidence, such as metallurgic and weaponry deposits on Anglesey, bog bodies that seem to have undergone the threefold death spanning across Europe, cultic equipment, and seemingly the long-lived holy site of Linguistic. But while evidence of Druids directly is absent, archaeological evidence of ritual activity and professional ritual classes is widespread, and is testament to the long-lived memory of sacred spaces. At the site of Feason Way in Thetford in Norfolk, for instance, around 60 AD, the Iceni tribe refurbished an enormous timber hall as a place to meet for political and religious events. After Queen Boudicca's defeat at the hands of the Romans, they dismantled it in an effort to wipe out any trace of Icenian power and discourage the glorification of the site. However, 300 years later, somebody appears to have buried a votive deposit of precious jewellery and treasure close to the spot where the hall once stood. This hoard included more than 30 silver spoons, many of which were inscribed with the names of local gods, some of them syncretized with distinctly Roman ones, most notably Faunus, the Italic god of the wilds. After the fall of the Roman Empire, the Druidic signature in mainland Gaul effectively dies out, and for the most part we can say the same for mainland Britain, outside of passing references to Druidic figures in medieval Welsh and perhaps Irish poetry. The 14th century Book of Taliesin takes its name from the eponymous Welsh poet of the 6th century AD, and with his shape-changing abilities in lyric poetry, Taliesin himself was in all likelihood a Druid. The same cannot be said, however, for the Irish mythical tradition, which is undoubtedly full of Druids. Things are not as easy as they may seem, though. Irish literature is sharply divided into pagan myths and Christian polemics or records. In the native myths, the Druids seem to retain their role as diviners and ritual specialists, but also as judges and court operators. We know that Druids of some sort were active in Ireland in the 7th and early 8th centuries, as evidence emerges unequivocally from the laws and penitentials that they were not merely conjurers or magicians, but retained some kind of para-religious role. In fact, there are allusions in the early canons known as the Synodos Episcoporum to their serving as guarantors of oaths. Equally, in the theological treatise, the De Mirabello Sacrae Scripturae, their promulgation of the doctrine of metempsychosis seems to have survived at least into the mid-7th century. These astonishing references, however hopeful, pose a difficult question to their prevalence, though. Were the Irish Druids as important or even playing the same role as Britannic and Gallic Druids? And the truth is we don't know. We can't ascertain a clear Druidic presence in Ireland any earlier, since it never became part of the Roman Empire, and thus none of the authors that we know of ever wrote about it. Given that the people who wrote down everything we know about the Irish Druids were early medieval Christian monks, their goal was to educate and largely convert Ireland. These early clerics were well educated in classical literature before arriving in Ireland. That means they would have been familiar with Pliny, Lucan, Tacitus and others before arriving, so they very likely injected the perception of European and Britannic Druids, or at least the classical perceptions of it, onto the Irish in their polemics, many of which were designed to ridicule paganism. The Book of Armagh, also known as the Canons of Patrick, is a 9th century Irish manuscript that contains a huge variety of early texts relating to St. Patrick and is famous for recording some of the oldest surviving specimens of the Old Irish language. The manuscript was once reputed to have belonged to St. Patrick himself, and at least in part to have been written by him. However, further research has determined that the earliest part of the manuscript was the work of a scribe named Fedormach of Armagh. Fedormach seems to have written the first part of the book around 807 or 808 for Patrick's heir, Torbach, the abbot of Armagh. The manuscript was incredibly important to the people of medieval Ireland. Along with the Bachal Isu, it was one of the two symbols of office for the Archbishop of Armagh. Notably for us, the first part of the Book of Armagh contains two biographies of St. Patrick that were written 2 centuries earlier in the 7th century, but preserved and codified in the book. One of the most important ones is known as the Collectania, written by the 7th century bishop Tírechán. And throughout the Collectania, Tírechán presents Patrick's journey throughout the north of Ireland and lists the very foundations that he establishes along the way, as well as his constant battle with Druids and early High Kings that centred around the seat of Tara. Tírechán wrote no earlier than the Great Plague of 664, yet early enough to have known the Bishop of Ultan of Armagh and study under him. Among his sources for collecting the life stories of Patrick was a book written by Ultan, as well as information passed on to him orally. It's here in the Collectanea that we see our first glimpse of a potential older eschatology recorded by Tírechán through the lens of Patrick's journey and encounter with Druids. The first of his passages comes at the point in Patrick's travels where he tells us how Logair, son of Niall, the pagan king of Tara, who had been opposing the newly arrived saint, had been terrified into partial submissiveness by a series of formidable miracles. He still, however, refuses to be baptized, claiming, quote, "My father Niall did not allow me to accept the faith, but bade me to be buried on the ridges of Tara. I, son of Niall and son of Dunlar in Maistu in Maglifi, face to face with each other, in the manner of men at war. For the pagans armed in their tombs have their weapons ready until the day of Erdathe, as the Druids call it. That is, the day of the Lord's judgment, because of such fierceness and mutual hatred." Logair and the son of Dunlaig here are portrayed as adherents of an ancient pagan burial rite, enabling them to continue to confront one another as enemies, and presumably to defend their respective territories until what we can only assume is the end of the world. On the surface, this seems to be merely recounting a pagan burial custom, perhaps similar to the upright standing stones mentioned in the tale of Cuchulainn. But notice that Tírechán explicitly claims Erdathe is the Druidic name for the Day of Judgment. Tírechán's statement that the Druids had their own term or even concept of a Day of Judgment is supported by the enigmity of the term itself, for which no concrete explanation has yet been provided. The word is almost too specific to be an off-the-cuff invention. It would not be hard to imagine Tírechán concocting the notion that Druids had their own beliefs about the end of the world in a similar way that the author of the Middle Welsh Mabinogi sought to add in a touch of historical prestige to his account of pre-Christian Britain by saying that Pideri, the king of Dyfed, was baptised with the baptism that they had in those days. But the uncomfortable point remains: where did he get the name that he claims the Druids used? A term that is seemingly unparalleled elsewhere in the literature and so far resistant to analysis. If you were to analyse it linguistically, the word seems to be a genitive, that is, a possessive modification, meaning that Erdathe is the possessive case, so we're actually talking about a day of Erdath. That seems to be confirmed by the only other reference that it shows up in Irish literature, in the 9th century text of the monastery of Tallaght, in a passage dealing with monastic regulations on fasting. Strangely, however, in this rendition, Erdath is translated from Irish as a great festivity and time of merrymaking. If you were to look up Erdath in the Royal Irish Academy Dictionary, this is actually the version that most editors use. It's assumed that the genitive Erdathe is just a misspelling here of the Irish word airtach, meaning refreshment or celebration or festivity. However, as John Carey has put it, this is unsustainable, since aedarthe is an O-stemmed word, with the genitive case being Erdathé. Equally, even if we take aedarthe as the semantic origin of Erdath, there is no explanation for the consonant shift from k to th. We could always invoke scribal error, but the chances of the same error occurring twice is very unlikely. One popular study, examining the manuscript itself, evaluates the issue of whether the word is actually spelled Ardathé instead of Erdathé. With this, they are able to construct an etymology of Ardathé as coming from ard, meaning height, and the word arthe, which comes from the words like ath, meaning ford or crossing, which occurs in Irish epics such as the Tyne Bow as a place of battle, referring perhaps to the otherworld. In this case, the word Erdathe would refer not to a day of exact judgment, but to a form of afterlife, where Logair will do battle against his enemies again. However, there are issues with this conclusion. The most prominent is that Logair does not describe Erdathe as a place. Tírechán specifies that it is a day or time. Instead, following Bisagni's work at Galway University, it makes a bit more sense to me to linguistically separate out the words into stems and prefixes to analyse them. In this case, we can view as a prefix, attaching to the much more important second syllable, dath. In this case, it seems likely that dath is a reflex of the Proto-Indo-European root duer, meaning to make smoke. The Proto-Indo-European root is well known, underlying the origin of not only verbs like the Greek thuol, to offer sacrifice by burning, and the Latin sufio, to fumigate, but also stands at the origin of thumos and theurgia. His evaluation of Irish morphological and syntax shifts is an excellent piece of scholarship, which would provide us ultimately with a meaning of Deus Erdathe as day of great smoke, or day of final smoke. While it isn't too much of a stretch to link great smoke with fire engulfing visions, having settled on a potential linguistic origin for the word, what evidence do we have that links Druids to a day of fire and brimstone? Well, again, looking to the Collectania, we have yet another possible, albeit indirect, reference to a prophesied eventual burning, or in very least conflagration of the world. Further on in the treatise, during Patrick's travel through Connacht, we are told, quote, "He came to the spring of Fimdar," which is called Slan, because he was told that the Druids honoured the spring and sacrificed gifts to it as if it were a god. It was a four-sided spring, and there was a four-sided stone in the spring's mouth, and the water came over the stone, that is, through the mortar, like a royal road. And the unbelievers said that a certain deceased prophet made a casket for himself in the water beneath the stone, so that his bones could whiten forever, for he feared the great burning of fire. Again, we find a similar theme. A pagan diviner, or perhaps prophet, which was of course one of the primary rules of the Druid on the mainland, feared being consumed in fire, and so entombed himself underwater in a pre-Christian Irish spring. This does map fairly well with Tírechán's assertion that the Druids had a vision of the end times, clearly involving a great fire or smoke of some kind. As it happens, this argument echoes the only other explicit classical testimony concerning Druidic eschatology in mainland Gaul, that of Strabo's. Drawing very probably on Posidonius, Strabo points out that the Druids in Gaul, quote, "say that the souls of the cosmos are indestructible, but that sometimes fire and water will overpower them." While this seems to be fairly conclusive evidence on the surface, we can't make the assumption that Strabo was recording an accurate doctrine, nor that the Gallic beliefs were also present in Ireland. Greek and Roman authors have a tendency to attribute philosophical tendencies to the Druids that they may not have possessed. Both Polyester and Caesar make note of the Druids' complex philosophical tendencies on transmigration of souls. In his commentaries on Gaul, Caesar remarks that, with regard to the actual course of studies, the main object of education is, in their opinion, to imbue their scholars with a firm belief in the indestructibility of the human soul, which, according to their belief, merely passes at death from one tenement to another. For by such doctrine alone, they say, which robs death of all of its terrors, can the highest form of human courage be developed. Subsidiary to the teachings of this main principle, they hold various lectures and discussions on the stars and their movement, on the extent of the geographical distribution of the earth, on the many different branches of natural philosophy, and on the many problems connected with religion. Returning to Strabo, while it's tempting to think that his reflections of a periodic destruction by fire was an authentic tradition among the Gallic Druids, it's worth remembering that the belief that the universe and everyone in it periodically being annihilated by fire only to be reborn as they were before is a fundamental Stoic doctrine, known as ekpirosis. Importantly, Posidonius, Strabo's probable source for the passage in question, was himself a prominent Stoic. So there is a chance that Posidonius was simply projecting his Stoic influence onto the Gauls. However, there are some reasons to think this may not fully be the case. If Posidonius did intend to portray the Druids as barbarian Stoics, then he doesn't do a very good job, and certainly he never makes it explicit. Neither does he attribute any other distinctly Stoic concepts to them. Equally, his discussion of human sacrifice among them seems to imply a similar distaste and desire for distance in his mind as with other Greek and Roman authors. Unpacking it further, the doctrine described by Strabo isn't really a straightforward copy of Stoic ekpirosis. Ekpirosis involves only fire, not water, and the Stoic universe that was consumed by this fire was not seen as indestructible, but was destroyed, at least its body, and then continually reborn. If we did wish to draw a closer Greek philosophical parallel to this Druidic sentiment, then the closest would probably be Plato's Timaeus, where the Egyptian priest is said to say to Solon that there have been and will be many and manifold destructions of men, the greatest of them by fire and water. But why Strabo or Posidonius should have imposed this notion onto the Druids is unclear and irrelevant at worst. I think it's more reasonable to suppose that Posidonius recorded their teaching concerning periodic catastrophes because, although it was distinct from the Stoic concept, it was still an aspect of the Druidic worldview that he was closest to and therefore recognised the most. We must also remember that the Celtic peoples in both Gaul, Britannia and Ireland are all of Indo-European descent, and therefore share a similar mother culture and mythological theme. It's perhaps not surprising that we see similar descriptions of world-ending events in other Indo-European and Germanic peoples, most notably the Norse Ragnarok. In the Norse Voluspa, a part of the poetic Edda, we find one of the stanzas that accounts for the cataclysm of Ragnarok. It's telling us that the sun grows dark, the earth sinks into the sea, the bright stars vanish from heaven, smoke rages with fire, the fierce heat plays upon heaven itself. In other words, fire and water overwhelm the world, leading to its rebirth. Interestingly, while not directly related to the end of the world, in the Caithfiméireaid Thuaidh, one of the most famous mythological cycles of Ireland, the Morrigan does predict a coming moral decline in the face of battle, telling us that I shall not see a world that is dear to me, summer without flowers, kine will be without milk, women without modesty, and men without valour. We can begin here to reconstruct a narrative of moral and environmental decline, followed by rising of seas and an engulfment by fire, signalling an imbalance of the elements, resulting in the total destruction before eventual rebirth and transmigration. Such a theme is clearly echoed in the Time Mokorinde, where the characters seemingly equate the imperiling of human life to the severe transgressions of breaking sworn oaths with a disruption of the three-part cosmological division, which reflected an integral component of pagan eschatological belief in Ireland. These references demonstrate that chaos within society is directly connected to the maintenance of natural order in the Earth's three component parts, and that the end of the physical world would result from a grievous human disruption of that order. Coupled with Tírechán's description of the Day of Erdathé as being the terminology employed by the Druids themselves, things are at least strongly suggestive of a possible pre-Christian origin for the concept. In such a case, Erdathé perhaps deserves to be seen as a unique survival of a remarkable cultural linguistic fossil, one that echoes pre-Christian Druidic eschatological doctrine. As Carey remarks, it's likely no coincidence that a core of Patrick's preaching was a focus on judgment and eschatology, as he was truly under the impression that by Christianizing Ireland, the void beyond the edge of the world, that he himself would be ushering in the Messianic age by converting the last people on earth. Patrick may have been imagined to be providing a rather unorthodox alleviation to fears already firmly rooted in the worldview of Irish paganism. With such a promise, he would have been able to offer his audience something that he knew they wanted.